What if I told you that one woman's ambition would change the course of England forever? Anne Boleyn, a name etched in history, not just as the second wife of Henry VIII, but as a pivotal figure whose rise and fall ignited a religious revolution, tore apart a kingdom and reshaped the monarchy. But did she really deserve the fate that awaited her? In this documentary, we'll uncover the untold truths behind Anne Boleyn's dramatic rise to power, her tragic fall, and the legacy that still haunts history. Stick with us, because the story you thought you knew might not be the one you'll leave with.
Now that you know what's at stake, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love seeing where our viewers are tuning in from. And if you're finding this story as gripping as we hope, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this journey. But if you're not ready to subscribe just yet, that's okay too. Let us know why in the comments. We'd love to hear what we can do to earn your subscription.
In the early 16th century, England stood at the precipice of monumental change. A kingdom steeped in centuries of tradition, its very foundation was about to be shaken by a single woman's ambition and resilience. Anne Boleyn, a name that echoes through history, would rise from the shadows of obscurity to become the catalyst of a revolution that would forever alter the course of England. Born into the noble Boleyn family, Anne's early life was marked by privilege and education. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a respected courtier, and her mother, Elizabeth Howard, hailed from one of the most powerful families in the country. Raised at Hever Castle in Kent, Anne was educated in the Netherlands and France, where she was exposed to the humanist ideals that would later influence her political and religious views. In 1522, Anne returned to England and joined the court of Queen Catherine of Aragon. It was here that she caught the eye of King Henry VIII, who was desperate for a male heir. Anne, however, was no ordinary woman. She refused to become Henry's mistress, a role her sister Mary had previously occupied. Instead, Anne demanded marriage, a bold move that would set the stage for a dramatic shift in English history. Henry's obsession with Anne led him to challenge the authority of the Pope. Unable to secure an annulment from Rome, Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, a move that would have far-reaching consequences. On January 25, 1533, Anne and Henry were secretly married, and 5 days later, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared their union valid. Anne was crowned Queen Consort on June 1, 1533, in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey.
However, the joy of their union was short-lived. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533, but Henry's desire for a male heir remained unfulfilled. Over the next few years, Anne suffered multiple miscarriages, and Henry's affection began to wane. By 1536, he had turned his attention to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. In April 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence against her was flimsy at best, and many historians believe the charges were fabricated to remove her from power. On May 19, 1536, Anne was executed by beheading at the Tower of London, a tragic end to a life that had once held so much promise. Yet, Anne's story did not end with her death. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to become one of England's most revered monarchs, ushering in an era of prosperity and cultural flourishing known as the Elizabethan Age. Anne's legacy lived on through her daughter, and her influence on English history cannot be overstated. In this documentary, we will delve into the life of Anne Boleyn, exploring her rise to power, her political and religious influence, and the events that led to her downfall. Through a careful examination of historical records and expert analysis, we aim to shed new light on a woman who was much more than the sum of her tragic end. Stay with us as we uncover the untold story of Anne Boleyn, a woman who defied the odds and changed the course of history. Born into the noble Boleyn family, Anne's early years were marked by privilege and education. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, secured her a place in the household of Margaret of Austria in 1513, followed by service at the French court.
Long before Anne Boleyn caught the eye of King Henry VIII, she was being groomed for greatness in the courts of Europe. Her journey began far from the English court, in the rich, intellectual environments of the Netherlands and France. Sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513, Anne was placed under the tutelage of one of Europe's most powerful women. Margaret of Austria, a niece of Emperor Maximilian I, wasn't merely a regent, she was an intellectual force, fostering a court that was a hotbed of learning, politics, and diplomacy. At the age of 12, Anne was exposed to Renaissance humanism, a movement that emphasized individualism, learning, and the questioning of established authorities, including the church. At Margaret's court in Mechelen, Anne wasn't just learning to read and write, she was learning the art of diplomacy, the intricacies of courtly life, and the complex dance of power. This environment was key in shaping Anne's character. She didn't just absorb knowledge, she learned how to wield it. Anne's education took another significant turn when she arrived at the French court in 1514, joining Queen Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, who had married King Louis XII of France. Following the death of Louis, Anne continued her service at the court of Queen Claude, the wife of King Francis I, a court known for its opulence, intellectual rigor, and vibrant culture. It was in France that Anne honed her courtly skills, mastering French, the language of diplomacy, and adopting the sophisticated manners and graceful charm that would later serve her in Henry's court. The French court wasn't just about dance and music, it was the crucible for the political, intellectual, and cultural currents of the day. Anne was exposed to the works of humanists like Erasmus, whose ideas on education, morality, and the church would later find resonance with Anne's own evolving views. France's influence on Anne wasn't just cultural, it was intellectual. The court buzzed with discussions on reforming the church, and Anne's exposure to these debates was pivotal in shaping her later support for the English Reformation. This was a time when Europe was beginning to question the authority of the Catholic Church, and Anne, though young, was beginning to see the possibilities of change.
Returning to England in 1522, Anne was no longer the naive girl who had left Kent years earlier. She was now a woman of intellect, grace, and ambition. Anne had learned not only the arts of courtly life, but also the more subtle and dangerous art of influence. In France, she had mastered diplomacy, and in Margaret's court, she had learned the strategies of power. She was prepared not just to survive the cutthroat world of the English court, but to command it. As she re-entered the English court, Anne knew that her education wasn't merely academic, it was a blueprint for her future. A future where she would be more than just a lady-in-waiting, where she would become the queen who would ignite the English Reformation and change the course of English history. Anne's transformation from the quiet daughter of a noble family to one of the most influential women in history was powered by education, intellect, and the deliberate acquisition of power. It wasn't just that Anne was educated, it was that she used her education as a weapon, shaping her destiny piece by piece through the lessons of Europe's most influential courts. In 1522, Anne returned to England and quickly became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the wife of King Henry VIII. Anne's charm and intellect caught the eye of King Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn's return to England in 1522 marked a transformative chapter in her life. No longer the young girl who had left for the courts of Europe, she returned as a woman of experience, education, and ambition. Her time abroad had honed her intellect, refined her manners, and sharpened her understanding of courtly politics. These attributes did not go unnoticed. Upon her arrival, Anne was swiftly integrated into the English court, securing a position as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the wife of King Henry VIII. Queen Catherine, a devout and dignified queen, presided over the court with grace. Anne, however, was a striking contrast, youthful, vivacious, and possessing a sharp wit that set her apart from the other ladies-in-waiting. The English court during this period was a place of opulence and intrigue, where power dynamics shifted rapidly and alliances were both forged and broken. King Henry VIII, once a charismatic and confident monarch, was now facing the pressures of an unfulfilled marriage. Despite his deep affection for Queen Catherine, the lack of a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty weighed heavily on him. Anne's arrival at court coincided with these personal and political tensions, positioning her as a figure of interest.
Anne's charm and intellect quickly captivated those around her, including the king. Unlike many women at court who sought to gain favor through traditional means, Anne was resolute in her refusal to become another of Henry's mistresses. She demanded more: a legitimate marriage, a crown, and a place by his side as queen. This bold stance intrigued Henry, who found himself drawn not only to her beauty, but also to her strength of character and determination. Their relationship, however, was not without complications. Anne's refusal to yield to the king's advances initially frustrated Henry, but it also set her apart from the other women in his life. She was not merely a conquest to be won. She was a challenge, a woman who commanded respect and demanded equality. This dynamic added a layer of complexity to their interactions, fueling Henry's desire and deepening his fascination with her. As Anne's influence at court grew, so did her understanding of the power structures within the Tudor monarchy. She adeptly navigated the intricate web of court politics, aligning herself with key figures and securing her position as a formidable force within the realm. Her relationship with Henry, while personal, was also deeply political, serving as a catalyst for the monumental changes that would soon unfold in England. Anne's time at court was characterized by her strategic alliances, her unwavering ambition, and her ability to captivate the king's attention. She was not merely a passive participant in the court's intrigues, she was an active and influential player, shaping the events that would lead to her eventual rise to power. In the subsequent chapters of this documentary, we will delve deeper into Anne's ascent within the court, examining the political machinations, personal relationships, and societal pressures that influenced her path. Her journey from a lady-in-waiting to the queen consort is a testament to her resilience, intellect, and unyielding determination to carve out her own destiny in a world dominated by men.
King Henry VIII's desperate need for a male heir led him to seek an annulment from Queen Catherine. Anne's refusal to become his mistress intensified his obsession. Tudor England, a kingdom steeped in tradition and precarious alliances, was built on the fragile foundation of dynastic succession. The Tudor line, founded by Henry VII after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, was still new, and the English throne needed a stable, secure bloodline to ensure its continuity. For Henry VIII, securing that bloodline became not only a matter of political necessity, but a personal obsession. A male heir was not just desired, it was demanded. At the heart of Henry's desperation was the fundamental belief that only a son could guarantee the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Henry's own father, Henry VII, had fought a bitter civil war to claim the throne, and though his reign had secured the Tudor family's position, that legacy still felt fragile. The last thing Henry VIII wanted was to be remembered as a king who failed to secure his legacy. A male heir was essential for the Tudor family to cement their reign and avoid the chaos of succession crises that had plagued England for centuries. The arrival of his firstborn, Mary, with his Spanish wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, had seemed promising at first. But as the years passed and no male heir followed, Henry's anxiety grew. Catherine, having borne him several stillbirths and miscarriages, could no longer be the solution to the king's pressing need for a son. The royal court, too, was growing restless. Whispers of dynastic anxiety swirled through the halls, with many wondering what would happen to England's future without a male heir to inherit the throne. In the eyes of Henry VIII, this wasn't just a matter of royal duty, it was a personal crisis. As he looked at his wife, Catherine, whose first marriage to Henry's brother Arthur had failed to produce an heir, the reality began to set in. She might not be the one to fulfill his greatest need. What Henry desired now was not just an heir, but a new marriage, a new beginning. And it was in the form of Anne Boleyn, a young, sharp, and ambitious woman, that he saw his opportunity for a fresh start.
Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress, a position that he had offered her several times, only deepened his obsession. This was no casual love affair. This was a calculated, high-stakes game. Anne would not simply bow to his desires, she would demand something far greater: legitimacy, respect, and the crown itself. This defiance struck at the very heart of Henry's desires, turning the dynamic between them from a simple pursuit of lust into a battle for the very future of the Tudor dynasty. The king's obsession with securing a male heir took on a new urgency. It wasn't just about having a son, it was about the survival of his bloodline, the strength of his dynasty, and his own sense of self-worth as a ruler. His desperation led him to take unprecedented actions. He sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII, requesting to dissolve his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry Anne, whom he believed would provide him the son he so desperately desired. But the Pope's refusal would become the catalyst for one of the most significant shifts in English history. In 1529, when the Pope refused to grant Henry's request for an annulment, the king, increasingly frustrated with the Catholic Church's interference in his personal and political life, began to take drastic steps. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. Henry would break from the Catholic Church, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This break was not just about Anne. It was about Henry's need to secure his dynasty and ultimately to gain control over the religious and political structure of his realm. The implications of Henry's desire for an annulment were monumental. His decision to seek the dissolution of his marriage to Catherine wasn't simply a personal matter of love and succession. It was an assertion of royal authority, a declaration that no power on earth, neither the Pope nor any foreign monarch, could dictate the king's will. It was an act that would reshape England's religious and political landscape for centuries to come.
As the tensions with the Pope mounted, so too did the stakes for Anne. She was no longer just the object of the king's affection. She was at the heart of a seismic shift in English history. Anne's influence over Henry was undeniable, but it wasn't simply her beauty that captivated him. It was her steadfast belief in her own right to be queen, her refusal to yield to the king's advances until the terms were right, and her own political vision for England. Anne's refusal to submit to Henry's desires without a marriage proposal was, in many ways, a mirror of his own refusal to be controlled by the Church. This was not just a story of a king's infatuation with a woman, it was a story of a man at war with his own faith, his own position, and his own dynasty. It was a battle that would reshape the very foundation of England itself, leading to the creation of the Church of England and the eventual fall of a queen who had dared to believe in her own rise to power. In the coming chapters of this documentary, we will explore how Anne's refusal to be Henry's mistress set in motion a series of events that would lead not only to the dissolution of his marriage, but to the creation of a new church, a new identity for England, and a new role for women in the political arenas of power. Henry's desire for a male heir wasn't just a personal obsession, it was the fire that would ignite a revolution. Unable to secure an annulment from Pope Clement VII, Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England.
Henry's desire for a male heir had led him to seek an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow. Despite years of petitions and negotiations, Pope Clement VII refused to grant the annulment, citing both theological and political reasons. The Pope's refusal was influenced by the political pressures of the time, notably the influence of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, who had the Pope effectively under his thumb. This refusal ignited a chain of events that would lead to England's break from Rome. In 1534, Henry VIII took decisive action. He led the English Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, declaring him the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This act effectively severed England's ties with the Roman Catholic Church and established the monarch as the supreme religious authority in the realm. The act was not merely a political maneuver, it was a bold assertion of royal authority over spiritual matters. The implications of this break were profound. Pope Clement VII responded by excommunicating Henry, stripping him of the title Defender of the Faith, which had been bestowed upon him for his earlier writings against Martin Luther. This excommunication further entrenched the divide between England and Rome. In the years that followed, Henry VIII and his successors would continue to navigate the complex and often contentious relationship between church and state. The establishment of the Church of England marked the beginning of the English Reformation. While Henry VIII remained doctrinally conservative, his break from Rome paved the way for future religious reforms. The dissolution of monasteries, the translation of the Bible into English, and the establishment of new religious practices all stemmed from this pivotal moment in history. As England grappled with its new religious identity, the personal costs of Henry's decisions became evident. Anne Boleyn, who had been instrumental in encouraging Henry's break from Rome, found herself increasingly isolated. Her failure to produce a male heir and the political machinations at court led to her downfall. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Despite a trial that many historians consider unjust, she was found guilty and executed.
On 25 January 1533, Anne and Henry secretly married. 5 days later, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared their union valid and Catherine's marriage annulled. In the shadowy corridors of Whitehall Palace, beneath the flickering torchlight of a cold January morning, a clandestine union was forged that would forever alter the course of English history. On 25 January 1533, King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn exchanged vows in a secret ceremony, witnessed by only a handful of trusted individuals. The location was the upper chamber of the Holbein Gate, a secluded and private part of the palace, chosen to ensure discretion and avoid the prying eyes of the court. The secrecy surrounding their marriage was not merely a matter of personal preference, but a necessity. At this time, Henry was still legally married to Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope had refused to annul their union. Anne, already pregnant with what they hoped would be the long-desired male heir, could not afford to wait for the slow wheels of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The urgency of their situation led them to take matters into their own hands, defying both the Church and centuries of tradition. The clandestine nature of the marriage was a bold assertion of royal authority. By marrying Anne in secret, Henry effectively declared his sovereignty over both his personal life and the religious institutions that had long held sway over England. This act was not just a personal decision, but a political maneuver that would have far-reaching consequences.
5 days after the secret marriage, on 30 March 1533, Thomas Cranmer was consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury.
His appointment was a strategic move by Henry, ensuring that the Church of England would be led by someone sympathetic to his cause. Cranmer's first significant act was to declare Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void on 23 May 1533. Just 5 days later, on 28 May, he declared Henry's marriage to Anne valid, solidifying her position as queen consort. The implications of this break from Rome were profound. By severing ties with the Catholic Church, Henry not only secured his marriage to Anne, but also established the Church of England, with the monarch as its supreme head. This move was a direct challenge to papal authority and marked the beginning of the English Reformation. Anne's coronation on 1 June 1533 was a public affirmation of her new status. She was crowned queen consort in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, a testament to her newfound power and influence. However, the path to the throne had not been easy, and her position remained precarious. The court was divided, with many still loyal to Catherine, and the political landscape was shifting rapidly. As queen, Anne faced immense pressure to produce a male heir. The failure to do so would not only jeopardize her position, but also the stability of the Tudor dynasty. The birth of Elizabeth on 7 September 1533, while a healthy child, was a girl, not the son Henry so desperately desired. This disappointment set the stage for the challenges Anne would face in the years to come. The secret marriage of Henry and Anne was a pivotal moment in English history. It was a bold assertion of royal authority, a defiance of papal power, and a harbinger of the religious upheavals that would follow. But as the years passed, the very actions that had secured Anne's rise would also contribute to her downfall.
On the first day of June 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, a testament to her newfound status. The bells of Westminster Abbey rang out across London on the first day of June 1533, signaling not just the arrival of summer, but a monumental shift in England's history. On that day, Anne Boleyn, once a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, a mere courtier in a foreign kingdom, was crowned the Queen Consort of England. This wasn't just the coronation of a woman. It was the triumph of ambition, a defiant moment of power that had been years in the making. The grand ceremony that day was filled with pomp and spectacle. The streets of London, thronged with spectators, seemed to vibrate with the energy of anticipation. Anne, garbed in a rich, gold-embroidered gown, was escorted through the streets to Westminster Abbey, where she would take her place as the rightful queen beside King Henry VIII. The procession was a visual declaration of Anne's ascent to the highest echelons of power. As she made her way to the abbey, the air was thick with the gaze of the court, the nobility, and the people, each one aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would change the course of the English monarchy forever. Inside Westminster Abbey, Anne's coronation was a dramatic and powerful event. The king, standing beside her, was no longer just a ruler. He was the man who had torn apart the old order, defied the Pope, and reshaped the very foundation of the kingdom. This was no ordinary coronation. It was the public sealing of Henry's boldest political move yet, the establishment of the Church of England, and with it, the reshaping of England's religious and political future. Anne's coronation was more than just a symbol of her power. It was a statement. By crowning her, Henry VIII publicly affirmed not only his affection for her, but his refusal to return to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The annulment of his marriage to Catherine, the break with Rome, and Anne's subsequent rise to power all stood in direct defiance of papal authority.
This coronation was the moment when Anne, not as Henry's mistress, but as his wife, officially took her place at the pinnacle of the English court.
But as Anne knelt before the Archbishop of Canterbury to receive her crown, she knew that this moment, though magnificent, came with enormous responsibility. A queen without a son, without the male heir Henry so desperately craved, was a queen who lived in a fragile position. Her ascent to the throne had been driven by passion, politics, and an unyielding ambition to secure her place in history. But now, as the crown rested upon her head, Anne's role as queen took on a new urgency. Henry's obsession with a male heir had made Anne's position precarious from the start. The coronation was a grand affair, filled with every display of opulence that the English monarchy could muster. Yet beneath the grandeur, there was an underlying tension. The court was divided. Many still saw Catherine as the true queen, and Anne's marriage to Henry had caused a deep rift among the nobility. The very legitimacy of Anne's crown was questioned by some, and she faced constant whispers behind her back. Her rise had been anything but conventional, and it left her surrounded by a mixture of loyal supporters and fierce enemies. The coronation was, in essence, the moment when Anne's past and her future collided, when her ambition and her fears coexisted under the weight of the crown she now wore. Though Anne was crowned with immense pageantry and public celebration, her path to the throne had been a delicate dance of influence, persuasion, and personal sacrifice. She was not merely the wife of a king. She was a woman who had navigated the treacherous politics of the court with skill and who had ultimately reshaped the religious fabric of England. But the realities of her new role were never far from her mind. A queen without a son was a queen without security, a queen whose power could crumble as quickly as it had been won. Anne's coronation, in all its glory, was not a final victory, but a new beginning, one that was fraught with challenges. As she stood before the court, crowned in gold, she knew that her true test had just begun. For Anne Boleyn, the road ahead would be marked not just by the glittering promise of power, but by the crushing weight of expectations. Expectations of a son, of an heir, and of her ability to maintain the crown that she had so fiercely fought to claim. As the crown was placed upon Anne's head, and the courtiers and the people cheered, the tension in the air was palpable. The victory was sweet, but it was tempered with the harsh reality of what awaited her in the coming months. For Anne, the glittering coronation would soon fade into the shadows of courtly intrigues, whispers of betrayal, and a husband's growing discontent. The question that lingered in the air was this: would Anne Boleyn, now crowned queen, be able to hold on to the power she had so desperately claimed? Or would her ambition lead her down a darker path, a path that had already been marked by those who had risen and fallen before her? The next chapter of Anne's life would reveal whether her crown was a symbol of triumph or a harbinger of her tragic fall. As Anne sat on her throne, the weight of her new position settled heavily upon her shoulders. The cheers from the court had faded, and all that remained were the quiet murmurs of a kingdom waiting for its next heir. Henry's desire for a son had not been satisfied, and Anne knew that her future was now tied irrevocably to the birth of an heir. Would she succeed in securing the Tudor legacy, or would the crown she fought so hard to wear slip from her head? The fate of the Tudor dynasty rested in her hands, and, with it, her very survival. Despite Anne's pregnancy, the birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533, failed to fulfill Henry's desire for a male heir. As Anne Boleyn's belly swelled with the promise of a new beginning, the entire English court held its breath. The months of anticipation had been fraught with both hope and pressure, not just for Anne, but for Henry VIII as well. This pregnancy, more than any other, was expected to solidify Anne's place as queen consort, to provide Henry with the male heir he had so longed for, a son to secure the Tudor dynasty.
The weight of this expectation was almost unbearable, and as the days passed and Anne's due date drew near, the atmosphere in the palace grew thick with tension.
On the 7th of September, Anne went into labor. After a tense and uncertain period, the moment finally arrived. Anne gave birth to a healthy, strong baby. The child, a girl, was christened Elizabeth. The world outside the palace walls must have held its collective breath, waiting for the announcement. Yet within the walls of the court, where power and lineage determined everything, the news was greeted with a mixture of quiet disappointment and barely concealed frustration. Henry had wanted a son, and this was not the heir he had been promised. Anne, however, had given him a daughter who would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I. But for now, Elizabeth's birth was nothing more than another tragic reminder that Anne had failed to meet Henry's most pressing demand, a male heir. The joy of motherhood, the pride of bringing a child into the world, was overshadowed by the cold reality of her position at court. This failure to deliver a son did not just affect Anne on a personal level. It had severe political implications. For the court, the birth of Elizabeth was not a triumph, but a sign of uncertainty. Anne, once the queen who had defied Rome and the Church, was now struggling to fulfill the most traditional and essential role of a queen consort, to provide an heir. In the context of the Tudor dynasty, where royal succession was paramount, Anne's inability to produce a son set her on a perilous path. A daughter, while beloved, could not guarantee the continuation of the Tudor line. The stakes could not have been higher. Henry's disappointment was palpable. The birth of Elizabeth had, in many ways, confirmed his greatest fear, that his marriage to Anne, no matter how politically significant, would not bring him the security he craved for the Tudor family. The king had broken from the Catholic Church, had cast aside Catherine of Aragon, and had elevated Anne to the throne, all in the hope that she would give him a son. But now, with the birth of Elizabeth, Henry faced the harsh truth: the future of his dynasty was far from secure. At court, the political fallout was immediate. Anne, once the darling of the palace, now found herself facing the scorn of those who had once rallied to her side. The factions that had supported her rise now began to turn. The conservatives, those still loyal to Catherine and the old faith, seized on her failure to produce a male heir as a sign that the queen was not up to the task. Whispers began to spread, casting doubt on Anne's ability to secure her place as queen. The loyalties that had once been firmly behind her began to waver, and she found herself increasingly isolated. Even those who had supported her marriage to Henry, now with the birth of Elizabeth, saw her as less of a future queen and more as an embattled figure fighting for survival. Henry's mood, once passionate and full of hope, began to shift. His attention turned once again to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who had become a quiet but undeniable presence in his court. For Anne, this shift was a bitter pill to swallow. She had known the cost of ambition in the court of Henry VIII, and now, with the birth of Elizabeth, her future as queen hung in the balance. The pressure on her to produce a son had never been greater, and now, with Elizabeth born, the weight of failure threatened to collapse everything Anne had fought for. The birth of Elizabeth was, without question, a monumental event in the history of England. But for Anne, it was a moment of cruel irony. She had given Henry what he had not wanted, a daughter, a future queen, yes, but a reminder that her place at court remained tenuous. Anne's future, once so assured, now seemed to hang by a thread. Henry's dissatisfaction, coupled with the shifting loyalties at court, cast a long shadow over her reign as queen. The birth of Elizabeth was a reminder of both Anne's triumph and her fragility. A moment of joy overshadowed by the looming question:
Could Anne hold on to her crown, or would her failure to provide a male heir be her undoing? In the coming months, the tensions would only escalate. The political climate in England was changing, and Anne's position as queen was more precarious than ever. Her failure to provide the son Henry so desperately desired, combined with the growing influence of Jane Seymour, would lead to a series of events that would forever alter her fate. The story of Anne Boleyn, once marked by passion, ambition, and defiance, would soon be tainted by the sharp sting of betrayal, and the crown that had once seemed so firmly placed upon her head would become a symbol of her greatest vulnerability. With the birth of Elizabeth, Anne's hopes for securing her place as queen now seemed uncertain. The loyalty of her supporters was beginning to falter, and Henry's attention was beginning to shift elsewhere. Would Anne's political and personal strength be enough to weather the storm, or was this the beginning of the end? As the clock ticked toward an uncertain future, the question loomed larger than ever. Could Anne keep the crown, or would her own ambition lead her to a tragic fall from power? Anne's support for religious reform and her influence over Henry VIII led to significant changes in English society and governance. As Anne Boleyn ascended to the throne beside Henry VIII, her influence reached far beyond the walls of the court. She was not just a queen in title, but a woman whose intellectual and religious beliefs would shape the future of an entire nation. While the world looked at her through the lens of her marriage to Henry and the failure to produce a male heir, what they failed to recognize was the quiet revolution she had set in motion, a revolution of the mind and spirit. From the moment Anne captured Henry's heart, she had a singular goal, not just to be his queen, but to be a catalyst for change. Her belief in the need for reform in the English church was not born out of idle ambition, it was rooted in her personal convictions. Anne, unlike many of the women in Henry's life, was not only captivated by power and status, she was intellectually curious, deeply influenced by the Protestant ideas circulating across Europe. It was these ideals that would become her weapon in her ascent to power and would later define her legacy.
Anne's support for religious reform was pivotal in Henry's break with Rome. Henry, whose desires for a male heir had sparked his initial rebellion against the Pope, found in Anne an ally who not only understood the political implications of his actions, but shared in his frustration with the constraints of the Catholic Church. Anne's Protestant leanings, though subtle at first, became a guiding force in her relationship with Henry. It was Anne who introduced him to the ideas of reformers like Martin Luther, whose criticisms of papal authority and calls for Scripture to be made available to the common people struck a chord with Henry. While Henry's break with Rome was initially driven by personal motives, it was Anne's passionate advocacy for religious change that helped shape the king's actions. As their relationship deepened, Anne's influence over Henry began to extend beyond the private chambers and into the very governance of the nation. Her vocal support for the Protestant cause became more than just a matter of personal belief. It was now a political movement that would alter the religious landscape of England forever. In the years leading up to the establishment of the Church of England, Anne played an instrumental role in pushing Henry toward a more radical break with Rome. She championed the idea that England should sever its ties with the Catholic Church entirely, and that the king should not only be the head of the Church, but also the supreme authority in religious matters. This would place England on a path of religious independence and set the stage for the English Reformation. Anne was not just a passive observer of these events. She was a key player in orchestrating the rise of a new religious order.
Anne's influence was felt far beyond the corridors of power. She was a woman ahead of her time, one who believed in the idea of a church that was both more personal and more accessible to the people. She supported the translation of the Bible into English, a move that would allow common people who had previously been at the mercy of the clergy to read the Scriptures for themselves. Anne believed in empowering the people of England, in giving them access to the religious knowledge that had long been guarded by the Church. Her role in the English Reformation was not just one of theoretical support, but practical action. As Queen Consort, Anne began to influence the royal court and the clergy. She advocated for the establishment of a national church that would be more in line with the ideas of Protestantism, a move that would ultimately lead to the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This act, passed by Parliament, recognized Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively stripping the Pope of his authority over English matters. While Henry's motivation for this break was personal, it was Anne's Protestant leanings and intellectual influence that ensured the success of his reforms. Her impact on English politics was equally profound. The creation of the Church of England was not just a religious revolution, it was a political one. With Henry VIII at its head, the Church became a tool of royal power. The dissolution of the monasteries, which began in the 1530s, was a direct consequence of Anne's influence on Henry. As the crown seized the wealth and land of the Catholic Church, Anne's position as queen became entwined with the emerging power of the state. This move not only weakened the Church's political power, but also enriched the monarchy, enabling Henry to consolidate his authority over both the spiritual and temporal realms. Yet Anne's support for Protestant reform was not without its enemies. The traditionalist factions in the court, those loyal to the old faith, viewed Anne's influence with suspicion. As her power grew, so did the hostility toward her. Her failure to produce a male heir, combined with the ideological divisions she had stirred in the court, created a combustible atmosphere. The very reforms she had pushed for would ultimately lead to her downfall. Her enemies, both at court and within the Church, used her association with Protestantism as a weapon against her. Anne, once a beacon of political and religious change, found herself isolated and vulnerable as the very forces she had helped set in motion turned against her.
Her impact, however, cannot be understated. Despite her tragic fall, Anne Boleyn's legacy lived on in the policies she helped to shape. The Church of England, which she had helped to create, became a lasting institution. The religious reforms she championed would continue to evolve long after her death, influencing not just the course of England's religious future, but the broader Protestant Reformation across Europe. And most significantly, her daughter, Elizabeth, would one day sit on the throne, ushering in the Elizabethan age, a period of unprecedented cultural and religious change that Anne could only dream of. But Anne's influence, though indelible, was not to be her saving grace. As the political tide shifted and her enemies closed in, the very reforms she had championed would begin to unravel her fate. Could Anne hold on to the power she had so carefully crafted? Or was her ambitious dream of a reformed England destined to become her undoing? The winds of change were blowing, and Anne's place in history was about to face its most bitter test.
By 1536, Anne's failure to produce a male heir and political missteps led to her waning influence at court. In the opulent courts of the Tudor dynasty, where ambition ran as deep as bloodlines, power could shift with the wind. And by 1536, the winds were turning against Anne Boleyn. Once celebrated as a revolutionary force, the very woman who had dared to defy both the Pope and centuries of tradition found herself standing at the precipice of her downfall. Anne's position as queen had been secured by her audacity, her intellect, and the passion she ignited in Henry VIII. She had been crowned with grandeur and hope, her ambition interwoven with Henry's desperate need for a male heir. But by the spring of 1536, the promises of the past were fading fast, and Anne's once radiant ascent began to cast long shadows. The birth of a daughter in September 1533 had been a moment of triumph in one sense. It was a healthy child, a symbol of Anne's motherhood. Yet, in Henry's eyes, it was also a crushing failure. The king's desperation for a male heir was all-consuming, and Anne's inability to deliver a son would prove to be her greatest and ultimately fatal flaw. Henry's shifting affections were becoming more apparent. As Anne's star began to dim, the king's gaze turned increasingly towards Jane Seymour, a quiet, docile lady-in-waiting who had captured Henry's interest. For Anne, the realization that Henry's attentions were drifting was a bitter blow. She had once been his obsession, the very reason for his break with the Catholic Church, but now she found herself standing in the shadow of another woman who seemed to embody everything Anne was not: submissive, compliant, and above all, a potential mother to the son Henry so desperately desired.
Anne, always a woman of fierce ambition, wasn't blind to the shifting tides. She had been the queen who reshaped England's religious landscape, who had broken with Rome, who had married a king. But now, as her position at court weakened, her once solid alliances began to fracture. The very people who had once supported her rise now looked to the horizon, eager to align themselves with the king's new interest, Jane Seymour. Anne's failure to secure her place, not just in Henry's heart, but in the future of England, was her most significant political misstep. But Anne's decline wasn't merely the result of her failure to produce a son. Her political missteps and inability to consolidate her power in the face of mounting opposition were also critical. In her efforts to maintain her influence, Anne had made enemies, both at court and among the powerful factions of the nobility. The conservative faction, loyal to Catherine of Aragon, never ceased to undermine her. They viewed Anne as an upstart, an interloper who had stolen the throne from the rightful queen, and they never ceased in their efforts to discredit her. In the courtly games of Tudor politics, alliances were constantly shifting, and Anne, surrounded by adversaries, had failed to cement her hold on power. The religious reforms Anne had championed, while revolutionary, also worked against her. Though she had been an ardent supporter of Protestant ideals, her religious reforms had alienated some of the traditionalists who still held significant influence. The court, a delicate balance of power, now found itself divided. Anne's supporters were growing fewer, while the supporters of the old Catholic faith, alongside those loyal to Henry's new mistress, were gaining ground. As Anne's influence waned, the political and personal attacks against her grew more vicious. Court gossip, once a mere murmur, turned into an avalanche of accusations, whispers of infidelity, of betrayal, of even treason. The same supporters who had once championed her rise now saw her as expendable. The seeds of doubt were being planted, and they would soon bloom into the most dangerous of flowers. Her failure to maintain Henry's favor would ultimately seal her fate. The very men who had aided her in breaking from Rome now found themselves standing against her. In the spring of 1536, Anne's world would come crashing down as accusations of adultery, incest, and treason were brought against her, leading to her arrest. The political machinations at court, the accusations against her, and the unraveling of her relationship with Henry would culminate in the final chapter of Anne's life, an execution that would shock the world and forever change the course of history. Anne's decline was as swift as it had been dramatic. The very reforms she had championed, the very changes she had brought to England, would now serve as the charges against her. Her ambition, which had once been her strength, now became the very thing that led to her destruction. And as Anne stood before her executioner on the 19th of May, 1536, the weight of her downfall was felt across the country. As Anne's world collapsed around her, the question lingered. Was her downfall inevitable?
Could a queen, who had once been the darling of the English court, truly withstand the forces that conspired against her? And what of Henry? Would his search for a male heir ever end in triumph? Or would the tragic tale of Anne Boleyn come to symbolize a lost opportunity, a moment in history that changed everything, only to collapse under the weight of its own ambition?
Henry's growing affection for Jane Seymour further marginalized Anne, culminating in his pursuit of a marriage to Jane. By 1536, the royal court was a powder keg of tension, and at its heart, the shifting affections of Henry VIII were the spark. His feelings for Anne Boleyn, once all-consuming, were now fading, replaced by a growing infatuation with Jane Seymour, a quiet, demure lady-in-waiting whose very presence seemed to embody everything Anne was not. For Anne, the realization that her husband's attention was drifting elsewhere was a bitter pill to swallow. The court that had once admired her sharp wit, her intellectual prowess, and her bold defiance of the Pope, now saw her as a queen who had failed in her most crucial role. Anne had given Henry a healthy daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Henry, still desperate for the male heir who could secure the Tudor dynasty, now turned his gaze to Jane, whose quiet charm and simplicity seemed to offer him the hope he so desperately sought. But it wasn't just Jane's demure nature that caught Henry's eye. It was the stark contrast between her and Anne. Jane represented everything Anne did not. Where Anne had been ambitious, passionate, and politically engaged, Jane was calm, submissive, and unassuming. Where Anne had defied the Catholic Church to stand by Henry's side, Jane's role was to be supportive, willing to submit to the king's will, and above all, to provide him with the male heir he so craved. As Anne's influence at court waned, Jane's star began to rise. Henry's infatuation with her was more than just fleeting desire. It was a political necessity. The king needed a son, and Jane seemed to represent that future. The court, ever attuned to the whims of the monarch, mirrored Henry's affections. Jane became the object of courtly intrigue, her name whispered in the halls of power, her favor solidified by the king's increasingly public attention. And, once the very center of Henry's world, was now being sidelined. Her failure to produce a son was the foundation of her unraveling, but it was the mounting affection Henry showed Jane that pushed her into the margins. The situation became unbearable for Anne. Where Anne had stood beside him with unshakable devotion, now his attentions were increasingly directed toward Jane. The realization must have been devastating for Anne, who had fought so fiercely for her place at Henry's side. Now she found herself in the difficult position of competing not only with her political enemies, but with the quiet, poised woman who seemed to be the embodiment of everything Henry desired in a wife.
The dynamics at court had shifted irreparably. Jane's rise was aided by her own political maneuvering. She was cautious, never overstepping, always aware of the delicate balance of power that the king's infatuation with her had brought her. Jane knew that her role was not to challenge Henry's authority, but to serve him quietly, a stark contrast to Anne's own assertiveness. While Anne had pushed for religious reforms and openly engaged in political power struggles, Jane kept a low profile, content to remain a silent figure who would quietly accept whatever role Henry wished to assign her. By the spring of 1536, Henry's obsession with Jane was undeniable. Anne's influence at court had all but evaporated, and the political factions that had once supported her now turned their focus toward the queen Henry clearly intended to marry. Jane had become the king's new obsession, and this was more than just a passing infatuation. It was a strategy. The marriage to Anne, for all its political significance, had failed to secure the most important thing: a male heir. Henry had long believed that a son was not just a personal desire, but a political necessity. and he now saw Jane as the key to that future. Anne, realizing her position was slipping away, fought desperately to hold on. She tried to leverage her political influence, hoping that the strength of her relationships with key figures in the court might still secure her place as Henry's queen. But it was all in vain. As Jane's power grew, Anne's faltered. The final blow came when, in May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges, though flimsy and widely believed to have been fabricated, were enough to condemn her. Jane's quiet rise had culminated in Anne's dramatic fall. What Jane represented for Henry was not just an ideal woman, but the promise of a future, one where his dynastic worries would finally be put to rest. The day Anne was executed, Jane had already been positioned as Henry's future. It was a tragedy for Anne, but it was also a triumph for Jane, whose quiet loyalty had been rewarded in the most dramatic fashion.
As Jane Seymour moved into the position of the new queen, the question loomed large. Could she deliver the heir Henry had always wanted, or would she too fall victim to the same relentless pressure that had brought Anne down? And what would become of Elizabeth, the daughter Anne had given birth to? Would she rise to become the heir her mother had fought for, or would her fate be sealed by the very dynasty that had destroyed Anne Boleyn? On 2 May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The trial was a spectacle, with key figures like her former suitor Henry Percy and her uncle Thomas Howard involved. The air around the Tudor court had always been thick with intrigue, but by May 1536, the atmosphere had turned toxic. Anne Boleyn, once the darling of England, had become its most vulnerable target. It was a day that would mark the tragic end of her meteoric rise, a day that would forever change the fate of the Tudor dynasty. On 2 May 1536, Anne was arrested, charged with adultery, incest, and high treason. Her world came crashing down in an instant. The charges leveled against Anne were nothing short of outrageous, a mix of political necessity and malicious intent. To the outside world, the accusations were appalling. Anne, the queen who had once defied the Pope, had challenged the very fabric of the Catholic Church and reshaped England's religious identity. She had been the woman who brought down Catherine of Aragon, who bore Henry VIII's hopes for a male heir, only to provide a daughter instead. The accusations of adultery were perhaps the most damning. Anne was charged with having affairs with multiple men, including several key figures at court, among them her former suitor, Henry Percy, and the ambitious courtier, Mark Smeaton. But to those close to the court, these accusations were as thin as the paper they were written on. Many believed that the charges were fabricated, part of a larger, sinister plot to remove Anne from power. It was an open secret that Anne had been no stranger to courtly flirtations, but the sheer scale of the accusations seemed absurd.
Then there was the charge of incest, an accusation that would send shockwaves through the kingdom. The claim was that Anne had engaged in an illicit relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn. This charge, which was both scandalous and absurd, was leveled by those who sought to ruin Anne's reputation completely. The suggestion that Anne had committed incest was a direct attack on her morality and character, painting her as a woman so depraved that she was willing to betray not just her marriage, but her own family. But the most politically charged accusation of all was treason. To accuse a queen consort of treason was not just a personal attack, it was a direct threat to the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. The claim was that Anne had conspired with the French and imperial ambassadors to overthrow the king, that she had plotted the death of Henry in favor of a new lover. These charges were nothing less than an effort to erase Anne's very existence from the royal narrative. The trial that followed was a grotesque spectacle, designed not to find justice, but to justify the inevitable. Key figures who had once been Anne's allies or close family members were now used against her. Henry Percy, the man who had once been Anne's suitor before her marriage to Henry VIII, was forced to testify against her. His testimony was filled with claims of Anne's unchaste behavior, painting her as a manipulative and deceitful woman who had led him on. Percy's testimony was not just an emotional betrayal, it was a calculated move to discredit Anne in the eyes of the court. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, played a crucial role in the downfall. A powerful figure at court and one who had been linked to the conservative faction loyal to Catherine of Aragon, Norfolk had long been wary of Anne's influence. In the eyes of her enemies, Anne had become a political liability, a queen whose religious reforms and political machinations threatened the established order. Norfolk, who had supported Anne's rise, now found himself in the position of aiding her destruction. His involvement in the trial was a stark reminder of the cutthroat nature of Tudor politics, where loyalty could shift in an instant.
The court of Henry VIII had always been a place where alliances were made and broken at the drop of a hat. And now it was Anne's turn to fall victim to the treachery that defined her world. Her trial was nothing short of a public execution of her character, designed not only to convict her, but to ensure that her influence was erased from history. The charges against Anne were never fully substantiated, and many historians believe they were purely politically motivated. It is widely believed that the trial was a sham, orchestrated by those who sought to remove Anne from the throne and replace her with Jane Seymour, the woman who had become Henry's new obsession. Anne's arrest and trial were the culmination of months of mounting pressure. Her failure to produce a male heir, the shifting allegiances at court, and her deteriorating relationship with Henry had set the stage for her downfall. But it was the political ambitions of those around her, the scheming courtiers, the power-hungry factions, and Henry's growing infatuation with Jane Seymour that turned the wheel of Anne's fate. As Anne was led to the scaffold on 19 May 1536, she faced not just the executioner's axe, but the political forces that had orchestrated her destruction. She had been the queen who defied Rome, who reshaped England, but in the end, she was nothing more than a pawn in a game of power and betrayal. Her death, swift and brutal, marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter for Henry VIII, one where his hopes for a male heir would again be placed on a new queen. But as Anne's final breath faded, the story was far from over. What would become of Elizabeth, the daughter Anne had fought so fiercely for? Would the kingdom that had seen her mother's downfall accept her as queen? Or would the shadow of Anne Boleyn's tragic end loom large over her ascent? On 19 May 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by beheading at the Tower of London. Her composure in the face of death was noted by witnesses. The morning of 19 May 1536 unfolded with an air of finality. Anne Boleyn, once the radiant queen who had captivated the heart of Henry VIII and ignited a religious revolution, now stood on the precipice of history's judgment. Her rise had been meteoric, her fall swift and unforgiving. The Tower of London, a fortress of power and intrigue, had become her prison and soon her execution ground. As Anne was led from the Queen's lodgings to the scaffold, her demeanor was striking. dressed in a gray damask gown trimmed with ermine, her dark hair concealed beneath a coif. She walked with a grace that belied the gravity of her situation. The path to the scaffold took her past the great hall, through Coal Harbor Gate, and along the western side of the White Tower to the black-draped platform awaiting her. Her every step was a testament to the dignity she maintained in the face of certain death. Upon reaching the scaffold, Anne addressed the assembled crowd. Her voice, steady and clear, carried across the courtyard. "Good Christian people," she began, "I have not come here to preach a sermon. I have come here to die." She continued, expressing her innocence and her unwavering faith in the law. "I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray, King, and send him long to reign. And to me he was ever and sovereign Lord." Her words were measured, her composure unshaken. As she finished speaking, she turned to her ladies-in-waiting, who had accompanied her to the scaffold. With a final glance at them, she removed her ermine mantle and lifted her coif, allowing her dark hair to cascade freely. She then knelt, her head bowed in prayer, awaiting the executioner's blow. The executioner, a skilled swordsman from Saint Omer in France, had been brought to England specifically for this task. Anne's request for a swift and clean execution had been honored. As she knelt, blindfolded and serene, the executioner raised his sword. In a single stroke, Anne Boleyn's life was ended. Her head fell into the straw, and her body crumpled forward.
Immediately following the execution, Anne's ladies-in-waiting, overcome with grief, gathered her body. They wrapped it in a white cloth and placed it in an arrow chest, which was then carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. There, Anne was laid to rest beside her brother, George Boleyn, who had been executed just days earlier. The news of Anne's death was signaled by the firing of cannons along the Tower Wharf. Within hours, Henry VIII had married Jane Seymour, his third wife, solidifying the political shift that had been set in motion by Anne's fall. Anne Boleyn's execution marked the end of one chapter in English history and the beginning of another. But what of her daughter, Elizabeth? Would she rise to fulfill her mother's legacy, or would the shadow of Anne's downfall forever overshadow her own path? Anne was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London. The morning of 19 May 1536 dawned heavy with an ominous weight. Anne Boleyn, once the radiant queen who had captivated the heart of Henry VIII and ignited a religious revolution, now found herself at the mercy of a court that had swiftly turned against her. Her execution by beheading was a brutal end to a life marked by ambition, intrigue, and tragedy. After her death, Anne's remains were hastily prepared for burial. Wrapped in a simple cloth, her body was placed in an elm arrow chest, an unceremonious coffin befitting the queen who had once defied the Pope and reshaped England's religious landscape. Her burial took place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London, a site reserved for those of high rank who had met untimely ends. Yet, Anne's grave was unmarked, a silent testament to the swift and unforgiving nature of Tudor politics. The decision to bury Anne in an unmarked grave was deliberate. As a queen executed for treason, her burial without ceremony or memorial served as a stark reminder of the precariousness of power. It was a message to others who might dare to challenge the established order. The absence of a marker ensured that Anne's final resting place would not become a site of pilgrimage or rebellion, a silent erasure of her from the annals of history. For centuries, the exact location of Anne's grave remained a mystery. The chapel, though a place of worship, had become a repository for the remains of those who had fallen from favor. Over time, the floor beneath the high altar had been disturbed, and the identities of those interred there were lost to history. In 1876, during restoration work on the chapel, the floor was lifted, and the remains of several individuals were discovered. Among them were bones believed to belong to Anne Boleyn. The remains were reburied beneath a commemorative stone, marking the spot where she had been laid to rest over 3 centuries earlier. Yet the exact identity of the remains a subject of debate among historians. Some argue that the bones may belong to Anne, while others suggest they could be those of another individual, such as Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's 5th wife, who was also executed and buried in the chapel. The uncertainty surrounding Anne's final resting place adds to the mystique of her life and death. Her burial in an unmarked grave, followed by the ambiguity of her exhumation, reflects the complexities and contradictions of her legacy. She was a queen who defied convention, challenged the religious establishment, and bore a daughter who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Yet, in death, she was denied the honor and recognition that might have been expected. Today, visitors to the Tower of London can stand in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and reflect on the life of Anne Boleyn. Though her grave remains unmarked, her story endures. The chapel, with its quiet dignity, serves as a poignant reminder of the transient nature of power and the enduring impact of those who dare to challenge the status quo.
Anne Boleyn's burial marked the end of her life, but not the end of her story. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would rise to the throne and become one of England's most formidable monarchs. Would Elizabeth's reign vindicate her mother's legacy, or would the shadow of Anne's fall continue to loom over her ascent? Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I, became one of England's most renowned monarchs. Anne's legacy has been immortalized in literature, film, and popular culture. Anne Boleyn's death, swift and brutal as it was, could not erase her influence on the course of English history. Though her life was cut short in a blaze of political turmoil and personal betrayal, it was the legacy of her daughter, Elizabeth I, that ensured Anne's place in history. Elizabeth would rise from the shadows of her mother's tragic end to become one of the most formidable and iconic monarchs England had ever known. The child of Anne and Henry VIII, Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, inheriting not only her mother's bloodline, but the strength, intellect, and resilience that would define her reign. Elizabeth's reign would usher in the Elizabethan era, an age of cultural flourishing, exploration, and unprecedented national stability. As Elizabeth's star ascended, the shadow of Anne's fall began to soften. Though Anne had been executed for treason, her daughter would eventually become the symbol of royal authority and political acumen. Elizabeth's ability to navigate the complex religious and political landscape left by her father's break from Rome was in part a reflection of her mother's influence. Anne's defiance of the Catholic Church and her role in the establishment of the Church of England had far-reaching consequences, not only for England's religious future, but for the world. Anne's story is inseparable from the tale of her daughter, and over the centuries, it is Anne's influence on Elizabeth's reign that has captured the imagination of historians, playwrights, filmmakers, and novelists alike. Anne's legacy was one of both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the Tudor court and to secure her place in history through her daughter, and tragedy in the way her own downfall was orchestrated by those who feared her power and ambition.
Anne's portrayal in literature and film has evolved over time, but one constant remains: her reputation as a woman ahead of her time, a queen who dared to challenge the established norms. In literature, Anne has been the subject of countless works, from the tragic and romanticized portrayal in Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall to the more traditional accounts of her life as a victim of royal politics in historical biographies. In these works, Anne is both a figure of sympathy and a symbol of defiance, a woman who paid the ultimate price for her ambition and her unrelenting desire to change the course of English history. The world of cinema and television has also been captivated by Anne Boleyn's story. Films and miniseries have depicted Anne as everything from a cunning manipulator to a tragic martyr. The 2008 film, The Other Boleyn Girl, starring Natalie Portman as Anne, introduced the Queen's complex relationship with her sister Mary and her tumultuous romance with Henry VIII. The film focuses on Anne's ambition, and though it takes liberties with historical accuracy, it continues to play a significant role in shaping public perception of Anne's character. More recently, in 2021, Anne Boleyn was brought to life in a dramatic television series starring Jodie Turner-Smith. The series, while controversial for its bold portrayal of Anne's final days, sought to humanize the Queen, giving voice to a woman often reduced to her tragic end. In this portrayal, Anne is presented not just as a victim of courtly machinations, but as a woman with a vision for a new England, one where religious reform and power could be wielded in the hands of the monarchy. But it is Anne's legacy in the modern cultural imagination that has made her an enduring icon. She has become, in many ways, a symbol of female power, intelligence, and ambition, albeit one with a tragic twist. The modern world, so often enamored with stories of women who rise to power only to be betrayed by those they love, finds in Anne Boleyn a reflection of its own fascination with gender, power, and ambition. Anne's life and death serve as a warning and an inspiration. Her ambitions led her to the heights of power, but also to the depths of betrayal and ruin.
Her impact extends beyond the realm of entertainment. The Boleyn name remains iconic in the fields of history and culture, and her influence on the shaping of England's national identity has been acknowledged by scholars for centuries. Anne's role in the creation of the Church of England, her influence over Henry VIII, and her vital place in the Tudor dynasty cannot be overstated. It was Anne, after all, who gave birth to Elizabeth, the woman who would go on to cement the Tudor dynasty as one of England's most illustrious. Through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy lived on, and the echoes of her story reverberated throughout history. As Anne Boleyn's legacy continues to captivate generations, the question remains: did her ambition and tragic end pave the way for Elizabeth's rise to power? Or did Elizabeth, in her own way, transcend her mother's legacy to create a new identity for herself and the English monarchy? Could the shadow of Anne's downfall have played a role in the brilliant successes of Elizabeth's reign? Or was it simply an inevitable twist of fate? Anne Boleyn's life was one of ambition, love, betrayal, and, ultimately, tragedy. Her story continues to captivate and inspire, a testament to her indelible mark on history.
But Anne's ambition was not without cost. Her meteoric rise had stirred enemies within the court, many of whom resented her influence over the king and her role in the religious upheavals of the time. The court was a world of shifting allegiances, and Anne's failure to produce a male heir for Henry only fueled the discontent of those who sought to replace her with a more docile and fertile queen. As Henry's affections turned toward Jane Seymour, Anne's once secure position began to erode. The very forces that had helped her ascend to the throne, her intelligence, her political alliances, and her relationship with Henry,
were now used against her in a plot to destroy her. In May of 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that, even in the midst of political turmoil, remain highly suspect. Her trial, a mere formality, was marked by a lack of evidence, yet she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Her execution by beheading at the Tower of London, a swift and brutal end to a life filled with passion and ambition, marked the final chapter in the tragic story of a woman who had dared to defy the expectations of her time. Yet, Anne's story did not end with her death. It was through her daughter, Elizabeth, that Anne's legacy would live on. Elizabeth, the child of Anne and Henry, would rise to the throne in 1558 and become one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth's reign, marked by cultural flourishing, political stability, and religious consolidation, was a testament to the strength and intelligence that Anne had passed on to her. Though Anne never lived to see her daughter's reign, Elizabeth's success would forever be intertwined with the memory of her mother's sacrifice. Today, Anne Boleyn remains a figure of fascination. She has been immortalized in literature, film, and popular culture as a woman who dared to challenge the conventions of her time. Her portrayal as both a tragic queen and a woman of power continues to captivate audiences around the world. In works like The Other Boleyn Girl and television series like The Tudors, Anne is depicted as both a victim of circumstance and a manipulative, ambitious figure. These portrayals reflect the complexity of her character and the multifaceted legacy she left behind. Her story, with all its twists of love, ambition, betrayal, and tragedy, continues to resonate because it speaks to the universal struggle for power, identity, and legacy. Anne's life, filled with triumph and heartbreak, serves as a reminder that even in the most turbulent and treacherous of circumstances, a woman's influence can reverberate through history in ways that are as powerful as they are enduring.
Anne's legacy, intertwined with the rise of Elizabeth I, remains one of the most compelling tales of power, loss, and triumph. But what of the others in Anne's story? What role did her enemies play in her downfall? And how did her death set the stage for the extraordinary reign of Elizabeth? Anne Boleyn's legacy has continued to inspire, provoke, and captivate for centuries. From her tragic downfall to the rise of her daughter Elizabeth, her story remains one of ambition, power, and sacrifice. If you've been moved by Anne's incredible journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this documentary with others who want to discover the truth behind this fascinating chapter of history. And, as always, leave us a comment to tell us your thoughts. What do you think Anne's true legacy is? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, thank you for watching, and keep exploring the untold stories of history.